In the mid-90s, Capcom's output in terms of 2D fighting games was virtually untouchable. Games like Street Fighter Alpha 2, Darkstalkers, and X-Men Children of the Atom managed to take the genre they had popularised a few years beforehand and expand it in a variety of directions. Whilst Capcom had clearly mastered the 2D realm, games like Virtua Fighter had introduced audiences to something new: 3D gameplay. A new challenger was headed Capcom's way, so they needed to try something new to head off the threat. Enter Star Wars. Sorry, Gladiator. Star Gladiator. As one of Capcom's earliest attempts at a 3D fighting game, the pressure was on for Star Gladiator to act as a representation of what to expect from the developer in the future. Initially released in arcades in 1996, Star Gladiator faced stiff competition from titles like Tekken 2, Virtua Fighter 3, and even Capcom's own Street Fighter EX. Despite this, it stood out for its detailed visuals and interesting fighting mechanics. It was built on the ZN1 arcade board, which was essentially an adaptation of the PlayStation hardware. For this reason, a home port of the game quickly appeared later in the same year. Now, let's get one thing straight. Star Gladiator is definitely not Star Wars. I said, definitely not Star Wars. Definitely not Star...
Ready, fight!
Fine. It's Star Wars. And, according to some information dropped by Seth Killian on an old Destructoid podcast, always has been. Star Gladiator supposedly started out life as a Star Wars fighting game, which explains the parallels that can be seen in both the setting and the presentation. There are some references that tread a very fine line between homage and copyright infringement, but it definitely helps to give the game a different flavour to the majority of other 3D fighters at the time. Let's just all agree to keep this game to ourselves and keep the lawyers in the dark. Outside of the sci-fi trappings, the other major novelty of the game was its weapon-based combat. This was certainly not unique to Star Gladiator, as other 3D fighters like Soul Edge and Battle Arena Toshinden had explored the same idea. However, the futuristic setting allowed Capcom to get creative with the weapons. Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, Hayato and Bilstein get plasma swords, like their Star Wars equivalents. In comparison, other characters are given weaponry that is a little bit more interesting. For example, June is a gymnast who fights with a plasma ring that looks like something straight out of Tron. Moving through the rest of the roster on the character select screen, it is clear that the artwork simultaneously represents both the best and worst of 90s 3D rendering, all at the same time. Some characters, like Geralt and Vector, are quite memorable and look great. Others, though, Luckily, the in-game models treat these designs much more favourably, especially Saturn and his plasma yo-yos. Actually playing the game is quite a different experience to many other fighters at the time, including Capcom's. The controls only use 4 buttons, unlike most Capcom games of the era that use 6. There are 2 buttons for weapon attacks, 1 for kicks, and 1 for guard. Characters are able to deflect and counter enemy attacks, leading to some very interesting risk-reward scenarios, both offensively and defensively. The game features a fairly robust combo system, with each character having access to multiple attack strings and some limited juggling capability. The game does feel a little stiff at times, but for an early 3D fighter, it carries a lot of depth thanks to the variety of options and systems at work. Visually, Star Gladiator is quite impressive. The matches are exciting to look at thanks to some smooth animation and unique looking attacks. The various weapons and distinct fighting styles of the characters lead to some dynamic looking fights, as do the hit sparks and other visual flourishes. The most impressive visual aspect of the game might actually be the backgrounds, which feature some cool little details and a lot more animation than most other 3D fighters of the era. Unfortunately, This graphical fidelity seemingly comes at the cost of performance, as the game only runs at 30 frames per second. It would have been nice to have seen the game running at 60 frames per second like many of its competitors, like Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn. 30 frames per second is acceptable though, especially given this is one of Capcom's first 3D fighters. The frame rate is consistent at least, so the gameplay isn't affected too badly. The music isn't half bad either, with most stages featuring a pulsing beat that accompanies the fights well. None of the character voices are particularly memorable, but they get the job done. Star Gladiator is a good time, despite some clunkiness in the mechanics and performance. Given it is an early 3D attempt from Capcom, it has held up surprisingly well over time. It doesn't scale the heights of the classic 3D fighters from the mid-90s, but it is still worthy of mention nevertheless. Hayato deserves better than just to be remembered by his admittedly awesome sprite in Marvel vs. Capcom 2.